Hi, I'm Audrey, and this is the story of how a bottle of juice, yes, juice, tore open years of silence, assumptions, and things we thought we understood about love. My mother brought it over one evening with a handwritten label that said, "For the pregnant one." But when my sister took a sip, it wasn't just her body that collapsed. It was the illusion we'd all been living under. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever been secretly controlled and done something behind your back by someone close to you? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This is a family story you don't want to miss. I had always loved the crunch of leaves underfoot, but that day, their brittle sound felt unusually sharp. It was a brisk Saturday morning in late October, and the town of Cedarbrook was just beginning to stir. As I stepped out of the bakery with 2 paper cups warming my hands, I caught sight of my sister, Laurel, across the square. She was arguing with Mom again. Nothing unusual there, but something in Mom's face gave me pause. That cold detachment, the same expression she used when she passed judgment without saying a word. I walked toward them, hoping to ease the tension, though I knew it was usually pointless. Laurel had been on edge for weeks, too many hours at the yoga studio she managed, not enough sleep, and lately, some kind of secret she wouldn't share. Meanwhile, Mom had grown more aloof, spending most of her time at the church thrift shop and baking for the pastor's wife. I sometimes wondered if she preferred the company of strangers. "Coffee," I offered, handing Mom her cup. She nodded, lips tight. Laurel avoided my gaze, clearly rattled. "You okay?" I asked her gently, stepping aside with her. She shrugged. "Just tired." But I knew my sister better than that. Laurel was always radiant, the kind of woman who made friends at the checkout line. But these days, there was a shakiness behind the smile, a weariness that lingered even after her upbeat voice returned. I'd offered to help at her studio, bring meals, anything, but she kept brushing me off. We parted ways shortly after. Mom claimed she had pies to deliver. Laurel said she had a client. I wasn't sure either was telling the truth. That evening, I invited Mom and Laurel over for dinner. I made a pumpkin casserole, Mom's favorite from when we were kids, hoping the familiarity might bring some warmth. Laurel looked pale, but came anyway. Mom showed up 15 minutes late, of course, arms full. She'd brought a tray of homemade cold-pressed juices to help with digestion, as she put it. I noticed each bottle had a little sticker on the cap with names written in her unmistakable cursive. "Thought I'd label them this time," she said, placing the tray on the kitchen counter. "One for you, one for Laurel, and one for our surprise guest." I raised an eyebrow at that last comment, but she said nothing more. Dinner was quiet, too quiet. I tried to fill the silence with little things, stories from work, the neighbor's new cat. But both women seemed distant, Laurel especially. After dinner, I offered everyone one of the juices. I took one with my name on it, a ginger apple blend. Laurel picked up hers, a dark red beet juice, with a label that read, "For the pregnant one, Laurel." She paused, frowned slightly, and glanced at Mom. Mom just smiled faintly, folding her napkin. Laurel didn't say anything. Maybe she thought Mom had gotten her wires crossed again. She opened the bottle, took a sip, and made a slight face but drank anyway. 10 minutes later, as I was putting away dishes and chatting about a new cafe opening downtown, Laurel stood up and staggered. "Laurel?" I dropped the plate I was holding and rushed to her. She grabbed the back of the dining chair for support, her skin suddenly pale and her breath shallow. I don't feel right," she whispered, eyes unfocused. Then her knees gave way, and she collapsed to the floor. I dropped beside her, panic tightening my throat. "Laurel, look at me! Can you hear me?" She was semi-conscious, her forehead damp with sweat. I turned to Mom, my voice breaking. "Call someone! Help me!" But Mom didn't move. She just stood there, arms folded, eyes on Laurel, mouth drawn tight in that same cold expression I'd seen earlier that morning. Like she was watching a stranger fall, not her own daughter. The hospital lights always made everything feel colder. Laurel lay motionless on the narrow bed, her wrist tethered to a beeping monitor, the IV line gently dripping something clear and life-saving into her arm. I sat beside her, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest, trying not to let the sterile air squeeze the breath from my lungs. She'd been unconscious for nearly an hour. The ER doctor had called it a reaction, unclear to what. They were still running tests. I couldn't stop replaying the moment she collapsed, the way her eyes fluttered, the way her knees buckled, and most of all, the look on Mom's face. That stillness, that refusal to react. I finally turned to her. She sat across the room in the molded plastic visitor's chair, flipping through a magazine she'd found on a side table, like we were at a dentist's office. Her purse, perfectly zipped, sat on her lap. She hadn't asked a single question since we arrived. "You didn't even flinch," I said quietly. Mom looked up, raised an eyebrow. She fainted. "She's been overworked, obviously. You know how Laurel is. She skips meals." I gripped the armrest. "You saw what happened. She was fine. And then she drank that juice." Her mouth twisted slightly. "Oh, please, don't be ridiculous. I made those juices myself, all organic. Maybe beetroot doesn't agree with her. That doesn't mean we jump to conclusions." I wanted to scream. "You labeled it for the pregnant one. Why would you even write that?" She shrugged. "I was being lighthearted." "No, you weren't," I snapped. "You never joke like that." She didn't answer, just went back to flipping the magazine, though I noticed her fingers trembling slightly at the edge. The nurse came in a moment later to check vitals. Laurel stirred, but didn't wake. "I should call Peter," I murmured, referring to Laurel's fiancé. Mom looked up again. "You think that's wise?" I blinked. "Why wouldn't it be?" She leaned forward. "Do you even know if he knows?" I stared at her. "What are you talking about?" She said nothing more, just offered a tight, inscrutable smile and leaned back again. It felt like the floor shifted beneath me. Was she implying Laurel was pregnant? Or that she wasn't? Or that she shouldn't be? Every layer of Mom's behavior felt like some kind of quiet weapon, a maze of implications and expectations I was too exhausted to untangle. After a while, I stepped out to call Peter. He was halfway across the state on a work trip, but promised he'd head to the hospital as soon as possible. I returned to find Laurel awake. Barely. Her voice was hoarse. "What happened?" "You fainted," I said, brushing her hair back gently. "Do you remember anything?" She shook her head, then frowned. "Wait, the juice." "You drank the one Mom labeled for the pregnant one," I said carefully. Her eyes widened. "But I'm not." I put a hand on her arm. "It had your name on it. Laurel, what's going on?" Before she could answer, Mom stood up and walked to the door. "I think I'll leave you two to talk. I have early church service tomorrow," she said lightly, as if she were excusing herself from brunch. "Mom?" I said sharply. "Did you put something in that juice?" She paused, hand on the doorframe. "Of course not. But maybe now you'll both understand that not every bottle in this life is meant for just anyone to drink." And with that, she walked out. I have a feeling my mother is doing something behind our back. It seems like she wants to control something. Or does she want to control us? But her child? If you sympathize with me, please leave a comment number 9 in the comment section below. Now, let's get to the next development of this story. For the first time in my life, I wondered if my mother was capable of something I didn't want to believe. Laurel had fallen asleep again, a little more at ease after the doctors said her vitals had stabilized. She was still pale, her skin cool, and the tightness in my chest hadn't eased at all. I sat by her side in the dim hospital room, the monitors rhythmically pulsing like a second heartbeat. But I couldn't stop thinking about what Mom had said before she left. Not every bottle in this life is meant for just anyone to drink. What did that even mean? I stared at the half-empty bag of Mom's juices on the side table, each bottle labeled in her neat, looping cursive. There it was again, Laurel, for the pregnant one. It wasn't just a joke. It was specific, intentional. I'd seen Mom write labels my whole life, from holiday cookies to church potlucks. She didn't play games with food. I picked up the bottle, turning it slowly in my hands. A faint reddish tint clung to the bottom. Beetroot, she had said. But that wasn't all. I unscrewed the cap and sniffed. Sweet. Earthy. But something else, too. Something faintly bitter. A nurse walked in just then, startling me. "Oh, just checking her chart," she said, smiling. "Looks like we're going to keep her overnight." I nodded, setting the bottle back. On my drive home, the questions started stacking faster than I could push them down. Why did Mom bring the juices in the first place? Why label one like that? Why didn't she panic when Laurel collapsed? And why, for heaven's sake, was she so calm now? I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a long while, staring at the steering wheel. I didn't want to go inside. Not yet. I knew what would be waiting. Voicemails from neighbors asking how dinner went, maybe a casserole dish on the porch, a note from Mrs. Reynolds next door with her usual sweet concern. And Mom. She would call. Or maybe not. Maybe she'd wait for me to call her. Either way, she'd expect something, an explanation, a chance to rewrite what happened. Instead, I drove past my house, around the block, and found myself pulling up in front of hers. Her porch light was on, the same soft yellow glow she always left burning at night, even when she wasn't expecting anyone. I stood there for a moment, then knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder. After a pause, the door creaked open. She stood there in her robe, hair pinned back like always, and that same polite smile on her face. "I figured you'd come by," she said, stepping aside. I walked in without a word. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and old books. Nothing had changed. Not the sofa with its knit afghan draped just so. Not the pictures of Laurel and me on the mantel, though I noticed, with a sudden pang, that none of them were recent. "I need to know what was in that juice," I said, turning to her. She sat on the edge of her armchair, folding her hands over one knee. "I told you, just beets, ginger, a little apple." "You labeled it for the pregnant one. That wasn't a slip." Her gaze didn't waver. "You've always been the careful one. Laurel rushes in, skips the details. You've known that since you were little." "This isn't about that." "I'm not the villain here, sweetheart," she said gently. "I brought my girls a gift. You can choose to see malice in it, or you can remember that I showed up to your dinner." I stared at her, a weight pressing down on my chest, and watched while Laurel collapsed. She looked away then, toward the picture window, where a street lamp flickered beyond the curtain. Her voice was almost inaudible. "Sometimes, what looks like harm is just life trying to set things right." I took a step back. I didn't know what terrified me more, what she might be implying, or the calm way she said it. That night, I found myself staring at the juice bottles again. This time, not as a daughter, but as someone searching for evidence. I sat at my kitchen table under the flickering pendant light, a legal pad in front of me, blank except for 2 words I had scrawled in frustration. What changed? The fridge hummed in the background. Next to me were the remaining bottles Mom had brought, each labeled in her careful script. For Laurel. For the strong one, just in case. My eyes kept drifting back to the one that said, for the pregnant one. She hadn't brought it for both of us. She brought it for Laurel. And then she watched her collapse. I opened my laptop and searched for common ingredients in cold-pressed juices. I wasn't expecting to find answers, but I needed something, anything, that made sense. Beets, ginger, apples, all normal. But if she'd added something else, something subtle, it could have passed unnoticed. I needed more than suspicion. The next morning, I drove to the hospital and waited in the cafeteria until Dr. Nash finished his rounds. He had a kind face, mid-50s, salt and pepper beard, someone who reminded me of the neighbor dads growing up. "I'm sorry to bother you," I began, catching him near the vending machines. Laurel's my sister, and I think something about the juice she drank might have caused what happened." He blinked, surprised. "The cold-pressed juice? Do you still have it?" "I do. 3 bottles, 1 half full. I brought it with me." He motioned for me to follow him to the lab intake window. "Leave them here. I'll ask toxicology to run a broad panel," he said, lowering his voice. "Anything else you want to share?" I hesitated. The bottle was labeled. My mom wrote for the pregnant one. His eyes narrowed. "Let's just see what the test says." I thanked him, walked out, and immediately drove to Mom's. I didn't knock this time. The spare key was still under the 3rd brick beside the porch, a detail she must have forgotten I remembered. The house smelled the same as always, but now the air felt different. Not heavy exactly, but tense. The kind of silence that waits to be broken. In the kitchen, I opened her fridge. More bottles. 2 cartons of almond milk. A jar of homemade pickles with 2003 scribbled on the lid. I opened the cabinet above the sink. Ginger powder, turmeric, stevia, elderberry concentrate. Nothing sinister, nothing out of place. But when I opened the drawer under the toaster oven, I stopped cold. Tucked beneath the rolling pins and an old birthday candle pack was a medicine dropper. Unlabeled, sticky. I picked it up with a paper towel and dropped it into a Ziploc bag from her pantry. My hands shook, but I made sure to wipe the drawer exactly as it had been. I didn't want her to know yet. Back in the living room, I glanced at the family portraits again. Still no recent ones of Laurel or me. Just the old ones. Frozen smiles, coordinated outfits, matching bows. What had happened to us? What had happened to her? The silence in the room felt colder now, heavier. I stepped outside just as a breeze rustled the dogwoods, early November chill brushing my cheeks. I clutched my coat tighter around me. And as I stepped out of her house, the dropper zipped inside my coat pocket. I realized something had shifted in me. I wasn't just watching anymore. I was finally starting to act. I never wanted to believe my own mother could be careless with someone's life, especially not my sister's. But the signs kept piling up. The next few days crawled by, each hour stretching like taffy under a summer sun. I'd sit by the window, phone clutched in hand, jumping at every buzz or chime. I told myself I was just being cautious, but deep down, I was desperate for reassurance. Any word from Dr. Nash that might offer a rational, harmless explanation, that it was all some bizarre coincidence. Maybe I'd been too suspicious. Laurel was recovering slowly at home. Her movements were tentative, deliberate, like her body was still negotiating its trust in itself. The fatigue clung to her, like an old winter coat 2 sizes too big, impossible to shrug off. Still, her appetite crept back in small ways. Half a sandwich, a warm bowl of soup, and the pale hue of her cheeks had begun to flush with life again. She hadn't asked about the juice anymore. "I don't want to dwell," she told me, with a smile too thin to hide the exhaustion. I envied that about her, her ability to shelve pain and move forward, no matter how bruised she might be inside. But I couldn't move on. Not yet. My thoughts circled like birds over carrion. That night replayed again and again. Mom's face, the way her hand lingered near the bottle, the way she watched Laurel, not in panic, not in fear, but almost with curiosity. And then there was the label, for the pregnant one. Her handwriting, clear, unmistakable. And the dropper, sticky, tucked away in a plastic bag, now hidden in the tin I used for old receipts and junk I didn't know where else to keep. I needed to know. I needed truth, even if it didn't offer comfort. On Thursday morning, I called Dr. Nash again, my voice hoarse from a sleepless night. "They're still working through the samples," he said gently, "but we did find traces of valerian root in the half-finished bottle. Not dangerous in most cases, but definitely not recommended during pregnancy." Valerian root. It hit me like a chill through the bones. It explained the fatigue, the dizziness, the fainting. It was subtle enough to mask inside a fruit blend, earthy, herbal, but potent enough to affect someone expecting. And Laurel hadn't even taken more than a few sips. I sat motionless in my car, parked in front of the grocery store, as the engine ticked quietly beneath the silence. It wasn't poison, it wasn't illegal, but it was reckless. At best, negligent. At worst, deliberate. The label hadn't said Laurel. It had said, for the pregnant one, not a name, a condition, a role. That wasn't just a friendly reminder. That was calculated. That was intent. Later that afternoon, I drove to Laurel's house. The porch swing creaked as I stepped up, and I saw her sitting there, knees tucked under one of Dad's old flannel jackets, the faded red checks stretched across her belly. Her eyes were far off, watching the neighbor's maple tree shed its last golden leaves like confetti. Autumn was fading. "I feel like I missed something important," she said quietly. Like the world shifted a little, and I was asleep when it happened. I sat beside her, tucking my hands between my knees. "Do you remember what Mom said that night, after you collapsed?" Laurel turned her head slightly. "Not much." She didn't rush to me, didn't scream. She just stared, like she was watching a scene unfold, waiting for the next line in a play. My jaw clenched. I swallowed. I don't think she meant to hurt you," I said slowly, "but I also don't think it was an accident." She studied me, the corners of her mouth tightening. "Are you saying she did it on purpose?" "I'm saying she brought a bottle labeled for you, and I found a dropper in her kitchen drawer." With residue, Laurel's arms wrapped tighter around the flannel, her gaze shifting skyward. The air was growing colder. She didn't answer, but she didn't deny it either. That night, I lay awake in my apartment, the walls pressing in around me like the hush of an empty church. I sat by the window with a chipped mug of tea, barely warm, watching the street lamp flicker and the shadows move across the sidewalk. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was responsibility. It was knowing something and realizing I might be the only one who truly saw it. Around 10, the phone rang. Mom's name lit up the screen. "I'm stopping by tomorrow," she said brightly, like nothing had happened. "I'm bringing Laurel a pie, apple, her favorite. And I have something special for you, too. A little treat. I stared at the phone, willing it to be a prank, a wrong number. You don't need to do that, I said evenly. Nonsense, she chirped. I insist. You'll love it. As she hung up, I caught my reflection in the window. Wide eyes, pale skin, mouth drawn tight. There was no more fog in my mind. No more wondering if I was imagining things. When I hung up the phone, I didn't feel dread. I felt clarity. This time, I'd be the one watching. I had the fire going early that morning, the kind that crackles just right and fills the cabin with the smell of oak and comfort. I'd spent most of the night preparing, dusting the windowsills, warming the blankets, setting out a basket of fresh bread and blueberry preserves I picked up from the old woman who still runs the roadside farm stand off Route 8. I wasn't sure who would show up or how this day would unfold, but for once, I didn't feel like I had to brace myself. Laurel arrived first. She looked different. Tired, yes, but also softer. She wore a scarf Nana used to knit every winter, the one with the crooked stitches we all teased her about. Laurel didn't speak right away. She just held out a tin of ginger snaps, the kind our mom used to buy from the German deli downtown, and said, I remembered you liked these best. I gestured her in and offered coffee. She looked around the cabin and smiled in that way people do when something reminds them of being small again. This is nice, she said. Feels like Nana's place. We sat in the quiet for a bit. The snow was still falling outside, but inside it was warm enough to melt the stiffness between us. I didn't know what to expect, Laurel finally said. But thank you for inviting me. I poured more coffee and leaned back. I didn't invite you, I said gently, but I'm glad you came. The next person to knock was Florence. She looked older than I remembered. Maybe it was the weathered coat or the way she held herself. She had a grocery bag in hand and a long silence riding on her shoulders. I brought soup, she said. Vegetable barley. I didn't put any pepper in. Thought maybe your stomach still can't handle it. I wasn't sure if it was an apology or a guess, but I took the bag and nodded. You remembered, I said. It's been years, but you remembered. There was a third knock, but it wasn't who I expected, not Mom. It was Mr. Coates, our old neighbor. He'd seen the car tracks, he said, and figured something was going on. He brought a small paper bag with 2 mason jars of his maple syrup, still made the old way, over the fire pit in his backyard. Just in case you're making pancakes tomorrow, he said, or want a reason to. That small gesture, from a man who hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to us in the last decade, touched something raw. Maybe kindness didn't always come from the places you tried to earn it. Maybe it arrived, quiet and unannounced, when you'd finally made room for it. Eventually, Mom did show up. No warning, no call. She just appeared at the front steps like it was any other Sunday. Her coat was far too thin for the weather, and her hands trembled not from the cold, but from something deeper. She didn't carry food. She didn't carry a smile. I saw the message, she said. I thought, maybe I shouldn't come, but here I am. For a long time, no one said anything. Then Florence walked over and held out a mug of soup, still warm. Laurel scooted over, made space on the couch. And me? I just listened. Not to words, they were few, but to what was between them. The space for rebuilding, for trying again, for acknowledging how many things had gone wrong and how many might still go right. Later, when the fire was down to glowing embers and the last car had pulled away, I stood by the window and looked out over the snow-covered yard. The sky was clearing. A sliver of moon peeked through the clouds, quiet and silver. I hadn't planned this ending. I hadn't scripted a grand revelation or a final confrontation. All I had was a cabin, some old recipes, and a heart tired of closing its doors. I turned off the last lamp and whispered into the warm dark. Maybe this is what forgiveness looks like. Some things change in a single season, others take a lifetime. And then, one snowy evening, they meet at a cabin warmed by more than firewood. I didn't know what I was rebuilding when I opened that door, but piece by piece, grace found its way back in. Turns out, kindness doesn't need fanfare. It arrives through mismatched mugs, quiet apologies, and showing up when it matters most. When we stop judging people by what they failed to give us, and instead see what pain they might be carrying, we begin to understand compassion. So maybe today, someone around you just needs space to begin again. And maybe, like a porch light left on in winter, your small act of warmth is what leads them home.